It's not usual for a wife to give the introduction, but who knows someone better than the wife? So you're about tonight to hear from a fascinating man, a man of many facets, many experiences which will fascinate you. I first knew him when I met him at a Quaker conference. So I want to say to you, the most important thing about this man is that he's a Quaker, because that will tell you a lot about his ethics and the values from which he operates. The other thing I want you to know is he's a man of a great compassion with a magnificently big heart. He has 5 children and he has 10 great-grandchildren. He's an entrepreneur who has owned a prairie farm, who has gone to Nova Scotia and bought a motel, tore it down and redone it, had several restaurants, a campground, who started an investment corporation back in the 60s, which is still going strong. He's a man who was a professor for many years, so he's a teacher and a researcher. A professor of agricultural economics at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, where he worked intensely with prairie farmers around the economics of their businesses. He is an author of a best-selling book called Start with $1,000, Do-It-Yourself Investing. He is a poet, also a published poet. You will be intrigued by everything he has to say to you. He is a social activist who once ran for Parliament on the Canadian Action Party. So listen carefully, for he has much to say to you.
My challenge tonight is to explain investing and to bring everyone up to date in terms of investing now rather than investing historically, because there's been some major changes. When I set out to do an investment project, I always start with a cultural analysis. And that's how I want to start tonight, a cultural analysis. In other words, what is going on out there in the world? What does it mean? What to expect from what's happening? For instance, yesterday, Peabody Coal, actually it's Peabody Energy, which is the biggest coal company in the world, went bankrupt. And they have customers in 25 countries. They have 8,000 employees. The business started in 1833. Its subsidiary went bankrupt twice, in 2007 and again 2015, and other coal companies that were rivals in the United States, like Arch, Alpha Natural, James River, they're bankrupt too. What does it mean that this source of energy is suddenly not in demand? What does that mean? It means something, doesn't it? It has to mean something. Item number 2 last week, the Panama Papers. Wow. A front page news on every media. And my best interpreter of the public interpreter of the meaning of money and finance. It comes from the United States and California. Her name is Ellen Brown. And she has a magnificent book here, which is best sold and many times over. And then her more recent book, this is Web of Debt, The Shocking Truth about our money system and how we can break free. Her more recent book is From Austerity to Prosperity, The Public Bank Solution. And I want to talk tonight about the public bank. We have a public bank in Canada, and I want to say a lot more about it. But here's what Ellen Brown had to say last week. She entitled her talk, War on Savings, Negative Interest bail-ins, push to go cashless. She's aware of what's happening in the world. These are things that are really happening. And on bail-ins, now most people don't know what a bailout is. It's where the taxpayers bail out the banks. Not the Main Street people, but the banks. They bail out the banks. That's where your money went. What if the failing bank is bailed in? In other words, it made a bad bet. Such a big bet in the derivatives market that it was no longer able to continue. Well, there's the senior creditors that have to be paid, and then there's the depositors that don't have to be, because Jim Flaherty, our previous finance minister back there, he brought in permission for the Canadian banks to be bailed in, which means steal the deposits. And you say, well, that won't happen. Jim said it wouldn't happen, but in case it did. Well, it happened last week in Austria. A failed bank was bailed in. The senior creditors, they didn't get dollar for dollar. They got 46 cents per dollar. And what do you think the depositors got? Nil. You're wiped out. That's what a bail-in does. And if you want to go back to his budget, Jim Flaherty's budget, page 145, that allowed that for the two big, what I call two big banks. There's not two big banks, they're TOO big banks. They shouldn't have banks that big. Well, in the United States, for instance, the two biggest banks are JP Morgan Chase, which is David Rockefeller's bank, historically, and British American, sorry, not British American, Bank of America. And they have $1.5 to $2 trillion of deposits. You say, well, that should be safe, right? They're not going to make such a bad bet. Wait a minute. Each of those banks, the two biggest in the United States, have a risk of $75 trillion. Now, what are those bets? These are derivative bets. They're based on changes in interest rates in the future. And what we know for certain is that the bankers internationally rig interest rates. So think about you're making a bet then based on changes in interest rates where you know that they're being manipulated. I think that's risky. Well, you'd say, well, they're insured, aren't they, for $250,000, your deposits in the United States? Yes. How much money is there in the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation of the United States to bail out $1 trillion, let's say? There's 25 billion. That's all there is. So if either of these banks went under, the insurance is gone. It doesn't touch it at all. That's what happened in Cyprus in 2013. The banksters tried to go after the insured part, and people in Cyprus went into the street and stopped the banks for a week. So, is your money deposited with a Canadian bank? It's at risk. Do you think there's enough money in the Canadian Deposit Insurance Corporation to pay the $100,000 that it's insured for? It's not. That's not there. Another item of news is not news. The Greek experience with the biggest European bank. The biggest European bank is Deutsche Bank. And they're in trouble. The biggest bank's in trouble, yes. But Greece is in worse trouble because the biggest bank, the German bank, is insisting on dollar for the money that they have lent to Greece to pay the bankers the interest on the loans that can't be paid. And this is 3 times in a row. And of course, the International Monetary Fund is one of those 3 entities. Then there's the global control of the world by the banksters. And they are, as Paul Hellyer puts it, the money mafia. And you need to know about them. This is not a conspiracy theory. These are conspiracy facts. I have here a study done in Switzerland of who controls the world. And they find there's 147 very tightly knit companies, and that their ownership is all held by a super entity that actually controls 40% of the total wealth in that network. And as Paul Hellyer said a couple of weeks ago, 62 families in the world own half the wealth. Well, you might say, who are these companies? I'll give you a list of the first 10. And you can tell me then, what industry do they come from? Barclays, Capital Group Companies, FMR, that's Fidelity, AXA, State Street Corporation, JP Morgan Chase, Legal and General Group, Vanguard Group, UBS, Merrill Lynch. Those are the top 10. And every single one of them is finance. In other words, they don't produce anything, they move the money marbles around. That's where the control is. And you won't find Exxon, Microsoft, General Electric there until you scroll down to, well, number 50 is China Petrochemical. There's a company that actually creates something. Think about that, controlling the situation and not creating anything. General Electric is one of my favorite demons, nemesis, whatever you want to call them. Back in the 1995, General Electric bankstered me and bankrupted me. So I took that personally for some reason. And so I keep studying them. And I can tell you right now, the official statistics on them is that when they made $26.5 billion globally profit, they paid minus $4 billion of taxes. They got $5 billion credit. Yeah, that sounds like a good system, doesn't it? Well, that's exactly what the trade agreements provide to the transnational corporations. These corporations here, they provide a means of controlling the resources of the country and not having to pay taxes. They're relocated in some tax haven someplace. And that's not just foreign companies. That's true in Canada, too, in many different ways. The biggest oil refinery in Canada is the Irving Refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. That's where I live in the summertime, is on the Bay of Fundy. So I'm not that far away, just across the bay. They don't seem to make much money because they don't pay much taxes. That's because the crude oil that they buy is very expensive stuff. They buy from Bermuda. Bermuda buys from Nigeria on behalf of Irving. It's called transpricing. So the profit is in Bermuda where there is no tax. That's just an example. What else is happening here? One more thing I'll mention. Canada. We have a new government in Canada, don't we? Well, is it really new? Well, most of the Harper government is still in place. Uh-oh. That means the waterways in Canada, 95% of them are not environmentally protected. Oh. And there's been no action on climate change in this budget. None. Even though Canada upset the Paris conference by saying, 1.5% in a 1.5 degree increase rather than 2, so we don't have to work as hard at controlling our emissions. And the fossil fuel subsidies of Canada are still in place. In other words, we're subsidizing the tar sands, which are one of the worst polluting activities that we have in the country and in the world. The same subsidies are there. And in the National Energy Board, who make decisions about pipelines going east, west, north, south, who's there? The control of it was taken by the previous government, Harper government, by putting in place a majority of the members of the board. Now, they managed to buy their way on with substantial contributions, and they're still there. So, will the pipeline be accepted? Will this one be accepted? Will that one? I'll leave you to think about that. And this terrorism bill, C-51. When I saw the Liberal Party, this is before the election, was voting for this, I wrote to Justin. I have to call him Justin. We don't call him Mr. Trudeau, do we? Or the Right Honourable, or just Justin. I wrote to Justin and I said, "What the fuck are you doing?" Those were the words I used. Well, he didn't respond, somebody else did. They gave me a page of garbage the next day. Well, okay, one more same old, and that is the privatization of our money supply since Papa Trudeau okayed this in 1974. That's pretty serious, isn't it? Here's how serious that is. You and I and everybody in the society since 1974 have paid unnecessary interest because we didn't use our bank. All the government expenditures were funded through the banking system at interest. And that interest was compounded year after year after year. Some of that interest rates, like in 1980, 81, were double digits. Prime rate, I believe in 79 or 80, was 22%. That means our national debt escalated 22% overnight, well, over a year. That's $5 a day for each of us now. If you count the provincial debt and the municipal debt and the federal debt. $5. What, here's two people right up front here, and they pay $10 today. And there's two more, they pay $10. I paid $5. There's $25 for unnecessary interest today, and tomorrow, and so on. Now, thinking of debt is very important because every country is deeply in debt. And the average household in North America is in deep debt. How deep? According to the Federal Reserve report 2 weeks ago, the average household in the United States could not come up with $400 of emergency money. They would have to go and borrow it because they're already borrowed up, and their monthly their monthly expenditures are 50% more than their disposable income. That's in U.S. In Canada, we're so much better, aren't we? 64% for us. Isn't that remarkable? Well, that's the situation every country, and not every household, but the average household in debt. Deep in debt. So far in debt that it isn't repayable. It can't be repaid. And unless you're as smart as the Icelanders are, you don't know what to do with this debt. The Icelanders said, wait a minute, we were in debt 8 times what our national product. 8 times. That means if everything they produced was paid, it would take 8 years just to pay if there were no costs of producing it. So they refused the debt. That was illegal, immoral, and so on. And they nationalized their banks. And now, the next thing they did was arrest the banksters and put them in jail. And they are in jail. And now they're going to have their bank, their national bank, that's got all the others involved, create its own money. Just like Canada used to do from 1940 to 1974. That's why these materials up here use our bank, and the Committee on Monetary and Economic Reform's litigation against the government for not using our bank. That's why this is so important. This is why Paul Hillier, in his book, Money Mafia, page 99, he says what to do about it. And on YouTube, on the talk that should go viral. I don't think it has yet, but it's on YouTube. That's what he says what to do. And this litigation, you'd say, well, why isn't the media explaining it and getting us on side about it? The answer is they never appear at any of the hearings. There have been four hearings. There's never a reporter there. They've been blacked out and told to not do it. Don't report it. Don't mention it. And despite that, we have one of the best constitutional lawyers in Canada. His name is Rocco Galati. And he took on the Harper government over the misappointment of Nadan to the Supreme Court, which was wrong. It was unconstitutional. And now his work there got a lot of coverage across the country, all right? And he was successful. A lot of his own expenses he paid. See that done. This is the kind of spirit that is required to get justice, financial justice in the country. It isn't readily available. Well, that's the situation, that's the cultural analysis that I want you to think about. I want you to also know that there's a difference between conspiracy theories and conspiracy facts. Now, I'm a financial analyst. I work with hard numbers if I can find them. I want conspiracy facts, and I've got them. I've got lots of them. I start with this one, the memoirs of David Rockefeller. In 1954, he and Bernard, the prince in Holland, got together and formed something called the Bilderberg Group, because the Bilderberg Hotel was where they met. So they called it Bilderberg Group, and they invited 100 top elitist people from politics and economics and the media. They had media, but they're all sworn to silence, and so you never heard about this. And it's met every year in secret. And you only have to see what happened after their meeting that was world shaking, to realize how empowered they are. For instance, in 1972, meeting in Norway, they invited the energy people of the world, not just Exxon and Royal Dutch Petroleum and BP and so on, but a lot of others. Yeah. What happened in 1973 to the price of oil? In 6 years, it went from $2 to $12. Huh. In 2006, they met in Canada at Canada. And the people there included Gordon Nixon from the Royal Bank, that's the biggest bank in Canada, and Ed Clark from the Toronto Dominion Bank, that's essentially the second biggest bank. Yeah, they were there. What happened in 2007 financially, in 2008? I seem to remember we had a fairly crisis, calamity, a catastrophe, and so on. Anyway, so I follow this man. This is not a young man. How old do you think David Rockefeller is? Give me a guess here. Do you know?
He's 100.
You know. He's 100 years old.
Younger than Bill Crim.
He's 100 years old.
Bill Crim is 2 years older than that.
Well, I asked who's the oldest one here. I better not be embarrassed myself by admitting to that. But as you get old and as you get to be in your 90s, what if your heart gives out? Well, it depends who you are. If you're David Rockefeller, you get a transplant. And what if that doesn't doesn't give you any compassion, let's say, if I'm being facetious? Well, then you get another. Then you get another. Then you get another, you get another, and another. This man has had 6 heart transplants, believe it or not. And they take place in his home in upstate New York. And I keep thinking about that as a conspiracy fact, because in his memoirs, he says populist paranoia is the part, page 405. For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents, such as my encounter with Castro, to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we're part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it. Those are his words. As I said, those are conspiracy facts, not conspiracy theories. And when you read the list of the control companies of the world, you find the top 50, not the top 10, or the top 20, the top 30, or the top 40. The top 50 are financial institutions. And of course, his is just one of those. UBS is one of, that's the second biggest bank in Europe. Deutsche Bank is the biggest one. On and on. You see, how it's easy for me to get worked up over the deliberate financial maneuvers of the political, financial, economic elite, when I realize they do mean to control the world. They do mean to overrun country after country and sabotage it with a trade agreement, like NAFTA. And our trade agreement with NAFTA is 22 years old. And what it's done for Canada is remove our manufacturing and send it elsewhere. It's taken the jobs with it. And it has allowed in the foreign countries, the transnational companies, like the U.S. Warmongering military companies, Lockheed Martin. Heavenly days, Lockheed Martin even did our census twice. I'm trying to do it again. What? What are we thinking of? Oh, we're not thinking at all. And General Dynamics is here in a big way. They just made a couple thousand, I think is the accurate number. It's not in the papers, of the LAVs. And Canada is selling those to Saudi Arabia. Wow. And Mr. Dion signed the permit. It's in the paper yesterday or the day before, front page stuff. It goes to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia will use those on Yemen, on wiping out Yemen. They're already doing it. These are the news from Yemen. That's how serious the culture, that's my cultural analysis. That's how wrong the world is moving. That's not why I entitled this talk, Investing Now. Because I do want it to be now, not yesteryear. If I go back in time to when you could trust people to a large extent, quite likely, in the finance business. If they said they'd do this for you, it would get done. If they told you this is what they'd learned, that's what they'd learned. It wasn't any chicanery or skullduggery. You could trust what they said. End of the era. It's not there now. There's no one you can trust in the financial business. No, there isn't. So, how do we answer these questions then that I raised on the poster? What is investing? Investing is putting your mind and your muscle and your money together. If you're going to start farming, or you're going to build a pyramid, or whatever you're going to do, you're going to put your mind and your muscle and your money together. This is the potent combo. That's what a business is all about, and that's what investing is all about. So you may not start your own business, but you're going to have to trust yourself. That's the answer to the question, whom to trust. You. Not somebody else. Not a bank. The banks are not trustworthy. How do I know that? I watched them deregulate themselves. They used to be regulated in the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s. And then in other words, they couldn't lend for more than 4 years. And they couldn't charge more than 6% interest. So there was an industry called the trust industry, and they did residential mortgages, and they checked you out. Can you afford this? And they didn't create money out of thin air like the bankers do by lending it, by lending money. No, they had to sell GICs. Or CDs, certificates of deposit and so on. So if they sold to you for 5 years, this much money, they could lend you a mortgage, that money. And they charged you more than they had to pay to get the money. That was how the trust industry worked. the mortgage industry. But as soon as the banks took away the restrictions, that happened at the end of the 60s, early 70s, then, hey, they create out of thin air by just writing, just punching the keyboard on their computer. They create money just like that. That's very, very simple. Then they create money, and they could run the trust industry to down. At the end of the 70s, I remember my brother bought a guaranteed investment certificate from a trust company, and it was 17.5%. That's a pretty good rate, wasn't it? Think about the trust company having to charge a higher figure in order to have a profit. So the trust industry was destroyed by the banks. And then the wealth management part of trusts, estates and that kind of thing, were just bought up for a song. So the banks had it. Next thing they did was go after the investment banks, the securities industry, which was separate. Okay, as long as they could create their own money, they could take that in too, and they did. Now they paid quite a price. And at the time, where I was working in finance, they thought that, hey, if you can learn banking in 3 weeks, you could probably learn securities and investment management and so on in 3 weeks. You can't. And they couldn't. So they ended up having to hire out of the securities industry and the investment banking industry the expertise. The next thing they went after was the other pillar of finance, insurance. You see where this brings you financially, brings you into a perfect conflict of interest. So anything a banker says is trying to do the same thing as the casino is trying to do. Separate you from your money. You have to start thinking of that, because that's what's going on. That's the purpose of the exercise. That's the role of the financial institutions. And the 50 there that are controlling the world, that's what they do. They separate people from their livelihood, from their well-being. Of course, they have some help on doing that too. They have Monsanto to poison your food with their genetically modified organisms. And they have the occasional pandemic, and they have the big pharma, which is the second largest lobby organization in the world. Is pharma. Finance is number one, of course, and pharma is the second. And in each trade agreement, you find that big pharma is there with all front feet and hind feet too. So that the CETA agreement, for instance, with Europe, means that the patent protection is extended another 5 years, so that the generic don't get involved. And the studies that say how much that'll cost is $2.8 billion for all us old geezers that are on meds, prescription meds. That's just one feature of a trade agreement. And that's, of course, in the Trans-Pacific one, which Chrystia Freeland, the new minister, went to New Zealand, signed on behalf of Canada, came back and said, oh, we're going to consult with people. We're going to consult. The people I've talked to who have been at these consulting sessions say, it's not consulting. It's only one-way instruction how this is going to be good for you, and it is a lie. It's not true. This is the reality of the new government for Canada and the sunny ways and so on. You have to look at what is going down, and this is going down. The TPP there was a major meeting in Ottawa a panel that had on it some of the expertise from Canada there. There's a couple of people you wouldn't know, but I just know them by name. But one I do know is Joseph Stiglitz, who is one of the most renowned economics professors, a Nobel Prize winner, worked at the World Bank, and he and a colleague at Harvard estimated the exact cost of the of the Iraq War. $7 trillion. There's a hard number. I respect hard numbers. I respect them with Stiglitz putting his signature on it. You betcha. At the Davos meeting, Davos, Switzerland, the Economic Forum, where all the smart people of the world get together and decide what they're going to do with us next. Stiglitz met with Freeland. He said, don't do it. And when he was in Ottawa, he was the keynote speaker. And he said, don't do it. That's how he put it. That's how serious it is. That's how important this is. These trade agreements get any dispute on the environment or on human relations or healthcare or whatever. If there's legislation that stops them from making money, they sue. They don't sue the province or the individual. They sue all of Canada. And that's happened with NAFTA. It happened with, one of the first ones was the Ethel Corporation in Virginia that had a carcinogenic additive to make cleaner gas. We banned it in Canada. Ethel sued us. And they walked away with $17 million. And we put the carcinogen back. Now that was then, that's a long time ago. Remember, this is 20 years ago. But the latest suits under NAFTA, Chapter 21, if you want to go look this up. And Chapter 21 says, yeah, they can do this. In Nova Scotia, where I hang out in the summer, we fought the New Jersey Concrete Company that was coming up to mine the basalt and take it back because environmentally it's destructive, and New Jersey didn't want them doing this, but to use basalt that's harder than granite, you use it for building roads and so on. A community of 1,500 people, mostly fishermen. Some of them fishermen for 4 or 5 generations. This is Bay of Fundy, where some of the best fishing in the world is. It's where the right whales come and feed and so on. It's a very, very precious piece of seawater. When we stopped them because of our environmental laws, after we were 5 years, and we had bake sales, and we had every kind of pulling money together from not very well-to-do community, and we had free expertise of various kinds, and we stopped them. We stopped them provincially, and we stopped them federally. Then they sued us for $188 million for the lost profits. And now they've figured out how that is going to be up to $300 million for the lost profits. But that is minor potatoes. I don't know the number. But the province of Quebec is being sued by a subsidiary of a U.S. company because Quebec says we don't really want the St. Lawrence River to be filled with drill rigs to frack the shale that's underneath. And there's a video on that. It's a It's a Dutch video that's out there. And then for the Nova Scotia one, there's a German video that explains this. And it's got one of my friends, Kemp Stanton, saying at the legislature when this first came up, at the provincial legislature, he said, "Over my dead body will they do this." Well, he's still alive, but they're meaning to do it. Yes, that's how serious this is. And do you think Christia Freeland will study either of those videos? They're translated. It's not in Dutch and German. They're English subtitled. Absolutely not. That's how serious the situation is. Well, then let's say, well, okay, if you're going to trust yourself on this investment venture, what are you going to expect? You're going to expect to learn. Of course, I'm not just preaching like a professor or something. I'm saying, yeah, I'm saying this. You're going to make a mistake. Hooray! You learned something. Yes. I learned something when I started to invest. I thought that studying economics and applied economics, I should know something about investing. And I had the money I saved after my master's degree at Guelph, where I paid off my debts, and so I got married, and I took my old car. It was a 1940 Plymouth coupe. Remember, this was in 1956, so it was a little less than brand new. Anyway, we went off on an assistantship to Indiana, to Purdue, and sure enough, we could figure how to live on $100 a month. Barely. And then we realized we were raising a family now, too. That's what happens, you know. So me learning to invest by putting some money where it seemed to make sense, like on my first investment was in a company whose name I'll give you later. It was a mining company in Western Canada. It had been prosperous, and it paid a dividend every 3 months for 25 years. It was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Well, that's pretty high standard then, and yeah. And the dividend was a good percentage of what I paid for the stock. It was $18, and they paid $1 dividend a year. Oh. And so that was in January that I invested it. And then in February, they cut the dividend. And in July, they removed it. So it wasn't $18 stock anymore. It became $4.75 when I sold it. So I lost 63%. Everything in percentages in finance. Name of the company? How Sound. I'm not kidding you. How Sound. It's the name of a sound out Britannia Bay in British Columbia. How Sound. Yeah. And the next investment was my own thought. I was working with a computer. This was old style computers, nothing at all like currently. But I recognized what they could do that I couldn't do longhand, you know, in calculating, and even though I specialized in mathematics, not that kind of mathematics that could compete with a computer. So I went with this company that had changed from a prosperous company into electronics. And they called themselves Consolidated Electronics. So I went to the broker to do that. He talked me out of it. He said, they don't pay a dividend, and they don't have any experience in the industry. Whereas this company, Sperry Rand, he said, they had the first commercial computer. And, they do farm machinery, they do gyroscopes for the Navy, they do all kinds of other things. And here, read this part pile of material about it. So, and I thought, well, what do I know? I'm just an idiot, right? What do I know about this? So 2 years later, I gave up on that, and I sold it, and I made $1.49 total. In other words, counting the dividends, it did pay the dividends. And the next investment I made was in the car industry, because I was studying cars on behalf of a policy paper at the university, and I studied the car industry as to whether the big three would make the little car or not. That was the issue at the time. So I thought, well, I know a bit about cars, and of course I've had a Chrysler product for some time here. They sold Plymouth. The outcome was, well, the basis for buying. I wrote this down. I wrote all these down in a little black book. Okay. They'd made $5 in the first quarter on the new model. And I thought, well, by golly, that must be selling well. They make another $5. That's $10 a share, and the stock's only $80. It used to sell for $100. Oh, so I bought some at $81. Mutual funds were buying it at the time too. Another reason. What happened? Well, it went up to 82. Then it went down to 44. Even though they did make another $5, and then they did add a $1 dividend. But what was happening back home at the plant was the workers in Detroit were sabotaging the Chryslers. So you might have bought a Chrysler Imperial. By the time you got it from the showroom home, a fender might have fallen off. So labor relations, not too good. Anyway, so that loss was only 33%. Then I audited a course with a professor, and he was a rebel. He said I was questioned once about being an economist, and therefore I should know about investing. And he said I explained at this cocktail party or whatever that we talk about demand curves and supply curves, and we don't get our hands dirty with investing, you know. And then I asked, well, why not? Why don't we? You know, like John Maynard Keynes was famous as an investor, and he was an important economist. So he said, well, this was right after the war, and he said, I studied, I checked out this company, American Woolens, and they made the uniforms for the military, okay? And they had all kinds of stock in warehouses full of materials, of clothing materials, and they were all price controlled. But he thought, well, after the war, they'll remove those, and this company will make a lot of money. So he bought 100 shares, he said, and he paid, I think he paid $8 for it, $800. He said, I even borrowed the money for that. And of course, the next year, they paid him $12 a share of dividends. So the stock obviously went high. So one of the things that Professor Selchuk said struck home with me. Like, he mentioned mining. He said a mine. A mine is a hole in the ground with a layer on top. Bang. That was my how sound investment, wasn't it? Yeah. He said 2/3 of American businesses run by idiots. What? And he was talking to the engineering students who were graduating, who at that time were being fought over by the manufacturing industry. They wanted engineers after the war. You know. So I buckled down and I went after thinking, how do you analyze an investment? And You have to use the universal business equation, which applies to any business, whether it's an individual owns it, or a partnership, a corporation, a cooperative, the government. And you realize that you need assets if you're in business. And you want the assets to produce something. And you want what it produces to have a market. So you want revenue. You want revenue out of those assets, right? And you hope your costs are such that they don't exceed the revenue, so you have earnings. So you've got assets, revenue, earnings. That's the universal business equation. So this is how you analyze an investment. You see how many shares are outstanding for this investment, and you divide that into total assets in the company. You divide it into the total revenue from those assets, and then you divide it into the total earnings. And then you get then per share assets. What do you have to work with? For every dollar you invest, is there 50 cents there, or $5, or $1? What is there? And for revenue, if there's only 10 cents of revenue, you're not likely to get very much per share on the earnings end. The price earnings is going to be nil or very low. So this is what you do. And that's what I did with a whole industry, an industry called the airline industry. I studied all of the companies in the business, including a Dutch company that was the first airline. KLM Airlines was 1925 was the first, and the American Airlines and so on. So I went through this, and I come up with one company gave me more assets, more revenue, more earnings per dollar than any of the others. Then I saw what the management was doing. Well, the chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board had taken over control of this company. And already they had new routes from Minneapolis, this was Northwest Airlines, from Minnesota down to Florida. Oh, that means all these snowbirds we're going to have a direct flight. And management was buying stock. So I risked all the money that my conservative wife and I could put together. Remember, we've got a family going here. I've got a $100 a month assistantship to live on. I have no certain future, even if I get my degree. But we bought 100 shares, and we borrowed some money to do it, a little bit. In 9 months, we had 179% gain. And then we bought some preferred shares that were convertible. Because we were shareholders, we could get a deal and we could borrow money to do that with. That was 204% in 2 months. And I wrote in the book, Right for the Right Reasons. That's what changed my outlook from throwing in the towel and saying, I don't know how to do this, to figuring out how to do this. And I haven't changed my orientation since. That's what I wanted to tell you about investing. Then I want to ask you, what are you going to do investing now? What are you going to do? Are you going to leave your money and deposit at a Canadian bank? Uh-oh. Oh, no. Oh, Will the savings that you have made have any meaning, or will they be confiscated? If we go cashless, then your money in the bank and everywhere else is just digits, which means it can be controlled by somebody else. The digits can be manipulated. And as has happened, as I said, Austria recently, Cyprus before, but Canadian banks are set up to have it happen here. And all of these countries and many of these banks are in debt, deeply in debt. Maybe you say, well, going cashless is a good thing in Japan. The latest idea is that your fingerprint, or maybe it's your thumbprint, I don't know which, it's all you're going to need to press the button to spend the money. Instead of the PIN on your debit or your credit card, signature or whatever. The short of that is that you're risking control of your money. And that is how significant that is. And we know that you can't trust the people that manage your money. You have to manage it. That's my message. Questions, comments? I overall should tell you one more thing about myself. That is that since 2008, I have had public talks in Winnipeg where I have relatives, immediate relatives. I have friends from a long time back, colleagues at the university, and investors that learned to invest and still are interested in knowing my thinking currently. And what my message was then in 2008 is identical with my investment today in 2016. It's got 3 red lights. Stop borrowing. Stop spending. Stop trusting anybody with your money. And there's 2 green lights. The biggie is start building community. And the second one is learn to grow food. That's my message. It hasn't changed since 2008, and I think we're a lot nearer a financial collapse globally than we have been in the history of the planet. And our environment is at risk in ways that it may never recover. And the villains can be identified, and heroes are scarce. But there are people that you can trust, what they study and what they do, what they say. Ellen Brown is one of those. Paul Hellyer is one of those. Michel Tuzadovsky is one of those. Toward a World War III scenario. But this is his classic book, The Globalization of Poverty and the New World Order. This is the best book to understand what globalization really is. And globalresearch.ca is the website, trustworthy. And there are individuals on the internet like Paul Craig Roberts. He is absolutely commendable in every way and knowledgeable politically and economically. See, economics used to be called political economy, which put the two together, and they are together. It's just that the half-assed economists, I call them, at the universities in Economics 101. They just use Paul Samuelson's book or something and all the nonsense in it. And it's all theoretical, and it won't ever happen. It's competitive economic theory, which is beautiful mathematically and irrelevant in the real world. So that's what if you want to browse these books, I can't sell you these, but I can offer you Paul Hellier's book and my video, Canada versus Banksters. This is my last Winnipeg talk in 2014. But if you play this on a computer, you'll find it also has other files. The Bank of Canada Act is there. COMER is the Committee on Monetary and Economic Reform, their newsletter, and the court decision, but that's the previous court decision, it's not the current one. And that's 75 minutes. It was in a church, you see. And I went there because I didn't think there'd be any banksters to interrupt me, and there weren't. I actually talked about the Bible there, and I made reference to how many references in the Bible have to do with finance and economics. I think the number is 260 some. People don't think about that. I wasn't thinking about that until in my Bible it had that reference at the back. The first person in 1993, no, 1995, David Corton wrote this book, When Corporations Rule the World. This is golden. He has written more since, but this is the basic book in the same way as Michel Tusadovsky's basic book on globalization explains what you really need to understand. If you'd like to browse on those, or if you'd like to buy these three, Paul Hellier's book, my video, or my ancient book. This is, I don't know how old, it's early 80s. These two editions of this book, best sold times 10 by a Canadian standard. That's not very high in the US, but in Canada, that's big. And the thinking in it, I think, is of use yet. And the orientation isn't different than I gave you, like trust yourself to learn, to be able to learn and proceed.